The morning Sallie Redmond walked into the Harlan Creek market with her chin up and her grief tucked somewhere beneath her sternum. Nobody in that dusty Wyoming town expected her to change anything about the way things were, least of all herself. It was the autumn of 1882, the kind of October that painted the high plains in shades of burnt amber and copper, when the wind came down off the mountains with a bite that reminded a person winter was not asking permission to arrive. Harlan Creek sat at the edge of a broad valley, a town of perhaps 400 souls if you counted generously, with a single main street that ran straight as a rifle barrel between a livery stable at one end and the new telegraph office at the other. The market occupied the center of that street, a wide-planked building with a covered porch where men gathered on Saturday mornings to trade news and tobacco and suspicion in roughly equal measure. Sallie had arrived in Harlan Creek 3 weeks prior, having ridden the stage from Cheyenne after burying her father in the churchyard there. Thomas Redmond had been a cattleman of modest success, and when the fever took him in late September, it left Sallie 24 years old, unmarried and considerably more capable than anyone yet gave her credit for, the sole heir to a small but workable cattle operation 40 miles east of Harlan Creek. She had come to town to sort out the legal particulars with the county land office and to buy provisions enough to see her through settling the ranch before the hard weather arrived. She was tall for a woman of her era, with dark auburn hair she kept pinned under a practical hat, and eyes the color of good creek water on a clear day, a shade somewhere between gray and green that shifted with the light and with her mood. Her hands were already the hands of a working woman, not soft, and she wore a plain wool coat over practical clothes without a trace of apology. She had grown up on the range, and it showed in the way she moved, economical and unhurried, reading everything around her the way a person reads weather. The market on this particular Saturday morning was full, which was why she noticed it so clearly. The way a wide, instinctive gap existed around one man in particular, as though the other ranchers and shopkeepers and wives moving through the crowded aisles had agreed between themselves, without ever speaking about it, to give him a circumference of avoidance. He stood near the dry goods counter, which ran along the west wall beneath a row of hanging lanterns, and he was studying a bolt of canvas with the same patient attention a man might give to a chess problem. He was perhaps 30 years old, broad across the shoulders in the way that comes not from showing off but from actual labor, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that carried 3 or 4 days of dark stubble. He wore working clothes, worn denim trousers, a collarless shirt, boots that had seen considerable hard use, and he held his hat in his left hand in a gesture that struck Sallie as oddly courteous in a man the rest of the room seemed determined to pretend did not exist. She watched for a moment. She saw it clearly. When a man with a large belly and a shopkeeper's apron moved down the counter, he curved his path wide around the standing man without making eye contact. 2 ranchers who had been talking near the flour barrels edged sideways as the standing man shifted his weight, creating space, the way water creates space around a stone. A woman with a basket on her arm turned around entirely when she saw him, and went to the other end of the store to get what she needed from the second counter, rather than pass within 6 feet of him. The man with the canvas bolt seemed to notice none of it, or perhaps he noticed all of it and had simply made his peace with it, the way a person makes peace with weather. He set the canvas down, picked up a second bolt, examined the weave. Sallie Redmond considered herself a fair judge of people, not because she thought herself exceptional, but because she had grown up watching her father manage men, and Thomas Redmond had always said that you could learn more about a person's character by watching who they avoided than by watching who they admired. She had been watching for perhaps 2 minutes, and in those 2 minutes she had formed a fairly firm opinion that whatever the rest of this room had decided about that man, she had not been consulted and did not consider herself bound by it. She also had a practical question that needed answering. She had come into the market needing, among other things, to ask about the quality of the hemp rope in stock, because the rope she had found at her father's ranch was sun-rotted, and she needed new lengths before she could properly work the cattle. The man behind the dry goods counter, the large-bellied man who had curved away, was currently occupied at the far end helping a woman with bolts of cloth, and showed no signs of rushing. But the man studying canvas was standing directly in front of the rope display, and he had the look of a working rancher who would know good rope from bad. Sallie crossed the room. She walked with purpose and no hesitation, moving directly toward him through the crowded space, and she saw the moment he registered her approach because his eyes came up from the canvas and met hers with an expression she could only describe as guarded surprise, as though he had prepared himself, over what was evidently a long time, for people to move away from him, and the sight of someone moving toward him had temporarily dismantled some interior arrangement he relied upon. She stopped at a comfortable distance, not so close as to be familiar but not so far as to suggest she had any ambivalence about talking to him, and she said, "Excuse me, I have a question about rope." He blinked. It was a slow blink, the kind that happens when a person is recalibrating. He looked at her for a moment with those dark, careful eyes. She noted they were a deep brown, the color of good saddle leather, and then he said, "Rope." "The hemp," she said, nodding toward the wall display behind him. "I need lengths for cattle work, and I'm told the market carries 2 different grades. I was wondering if you could tell me which one holds tension better in cold weather, because I've been getting conflicting advice." He turned and looked at the rope as though verifying it was in fact there. Then he looked back at her. "You're asking me. You look like a working rancher," she said simply. "You would know." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, like sunlight moving briefly across a field. He put the canvas bolt down and stepped slightly to one side so they were both facing the rope display. He reached up and took down a coil of the darker hemp without any show of hesitation. "This one," he said. "The lighter grade looks cheaper and it holds fine through summer work, but once the temperatures drop and the fibers contract, you'll get breakage under load. The darker hemp is a natural oil treatment they do at the mill in Laramie. Costs 4 cents more per yard, but you won't be replacing it in February." He handed the coil to her. She took it, tested the twist with her fingers, felt the density and the slight waxy quality of the treated fibers. "That's a straight answer," she said, looking up. "Thank you." "You're welcome," he said. He picked up his hat, and for a moment she thought he was going to put it on and walk away, back into whatever isolated orbit he had been keeping. She said, "I'm Sallie Redmond. I've just taken over the Redmond ranch out on the East Fork. My father died last month." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry about your father." "Thank you." She paused. "I don't know many people in the valley yet. I only know that you are the man every rancher in this room has spent the last 20 minutes trying to avoid, and I've been watching long enough to know it isn't because of anything I can see." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Clarence Wilcox." He said it the way a man says a name he knows causes a reaction, watching to see what kind. She met his eyes. "What is it they're afraid of, Mr. Wilcox?" He looked at her with an expression that was caught between appreciation and something older and more careful. He said, "Do you want the short version or the true one?" "In my experience," she said, "those are usually the same thing." He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a real smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his face briefly, making him look less like a man who had been carrying a long weight and more like the man he might have been before whatever had happened to put that weight on him. He said, "My ranch borders the Cleary operation to the north. Chester Cleary is the largest cattle holder in this valley, and he has plans for the grazing land along the creek that don't include sharing it with anyone else. I've been in a legal dispute with him for 2 years over water rights. Cleary is the kind of man who makes it known, quietly but clearly, that doing business with me is doing business against him. Most people in this valley have decided that's not a risk worth taking." Sallie looked at the room, at the wide berths and the avoidance patterns, and she thought about her father's voice saying what he used to say. Power that has to frighten people into loyalty is not actually power, it is debt wearing a hat. And the water rights, she said, are they legitimately yours? My grandfather filed on that creek in 1861, Clarence said. The documentation is in the county records. Cleary's lawyers have been arguing that a subsequent filing in 1874 supersedes it. I have a territorial lawyer working on it in Cheyenne. Sallie nodded slowly. She was not a woman who made large decisions carelessly, but she had also learned from her father that there was such a thing as a moment you either stepped into or stepped back from, and once you had stepped back it was difficult to find the same moment again. She said, "My ranch is on the East Fork. Do you know the Redmond property?" "I know it," he said. "Good grass, good water. Your father ran about 300 head. 260, she said. "I'll build it back. I'll need more rope." She said it in a tone that included him, that suggested without explicitly stating that she was not, personally, afraid of Chester Cleary or his social arrangements, and she watched the guarded surprise move through his face again like a cloud shadow moving across open country. "The Redmond Ranch is a good piece of land," he said carefully. "It is," she agreed. She paid for the rope and 3 other items, and then she turned back to him before she left and said, "I'll be at the market next Saturday as well." "Good morning, Mr. Wilcox." "Good morning, Miss Redmond," he said. She walked out into the October morning, and the bell above the market door rang twice in the wind. Clarence Wilcox stood at the dry goods counter for a long moment after she left, holding his hat, and the shopkeeper eventually came over and asked if he needed assistance with the canvas. And Clarence said no. He had changed his mind about the canvas. He bought his rope and his tack supplies and his coffee, and he rode out of Harlan Creek on his big gray horse toward his ranch to the northwest. And for the first time in a considerable stretch of months, he rode home thinking about something other than water rights. His ranch sat in a shallow draw where 3 cottonwood trees had grown up around a reliable spring, and the house he had built on the place was modest but well-made 2 rooms, a good chimney, a covered porch facing south. He had built it with his own hands over the course of a summer, which had given him the kind of confidence in it that you only get from a thing you made yourself. His operation ran about 400 head currently, reduced from the 600 he had managed before the legal troubles had made hiring help a complicated proposition, since most of the working cowboys in the valley were either employed by Cleary or reluctant to antagonize him. He had one man who worked the ranch with him, an older fellow named Preston Wade, who had been with Clarence's father, and had stayed out of loyalty and stubbornness in roughly equal portions. Preston was 61 and had a bad hip and an unshakable opinion about everything, and he was the closest thing to family that Clarence had left after his parents died. His mother in the winter of 1879, his father the following spring, back-to-back losses that had left him managing the ranch alone at 28, with a legal dispute gathering on the horizon like a slow storm. When Clarence rode in that Saturday afternoon, Preston was mending a fence post near the barn with the particular grim focus he brought to all tasks he considered beneath his dignity but necessary. Preston looked up at him and said, "You're back early." "Cleary's men were at the market," Clarence said, which explained why he had not stayed to attend to all his business in town. It did not seem worth elaborating upon. "Anything happen?" Preston asked. Clarence was quiet for a moment. "A woman talked to me," he said. Preston straightened up as much as his hip allowed and gave Clarence the look he reserved for statements that required more information. "A woman. Redmond's daughter. She's taken over the East Fork Ranch." Preston considered this. He had known Thomas Redmond slightly, the way ranchers in the same valley know each other, a nod at the market and an occasional exchange at the water committee meetings. He said, "She's not afraid of Cleary." "Didn't seem to be," Clarence said. Preston looked at him for another long moment and then went back to his fence post and said without particular emphasis, "Well, that's something." It was something. Clarence did not fully understand, yet just how much of something it was going to turn out to be. The following Saturday he arrived at the market at 9 in the morning, which was earlier than his usual practice, and he told himself it was because he had more supplies to buy than typical. He purchased his coffee and his tack oil and a new file for the grinding wheel, and he was standing at the counter, reviewing a list he had written on a folded piece of paper when the bell above the door rang, and Sallie Redmond walked in out of the cold morning with her cheeks flushed from the ride, and her practical hat slightly askew from the wind. She scanned the room with those shifting gray-green eyes, and when they found him she came directly over, which by itself was enough to cause a low ripple of observation among the other people in the market, because everybody in Harlan Creek had noted with interest last week that Thomas Redmond's daughter had spoken to Clarence Wilcox, and opinions about this were distributed unevenly. She said, "Good morning, Mr. Wilcox. How is your ranch faring with the early cold?" "Well enough," he said. "The cattle are in better condition than they were last October. I found the east pasture fence in poor repair," she said. "I've been mending it. How many head do you run?" 400, he said. "Reduced from 6. She heard the implication in that and did not pretend she did not. She said, "And Cleary's operation? 1,500, possibly more. He has 3 separate grazing allotments and the water from the north branch of Harlan Creek. What he wants is the south branch as well, which is what my grandfather filed on." Sallie set her basket on the counter and leaned against it with her arms crossed in a posture that was comfortable and direct. She said, "Do you have a surveyor's documentation of the original filing?" He looked at her. "You know about water filings." "My father spent 3 years fighting with a neighbor over an irrigation ditch in Colorado before we moved to Wyoming," she said. "I learned more about water law than I ever expected to need. Do you have the surveyor's documentation?" "I have the original claim documents," he said. "My lawyer in Cheyenne has copies. The dispute is over whether the 1874 filing, which was done by a man named Hargrove who subsequently sold to Cleary, constitutes a superseding claim under territorial law." "Hargrove," she said, "was the 1874 filing for the same water source or a different point on the same creek?" He was looking at her with an expression of careful attention. "A different point." Hargrove filed on a stock pond fed by the creek. He argued the pond constituted a distinct water source. "It does not," she said with a confidence that came from somewhere specific rather than from thin air. "Under territorial water law, which follows the Colorado prior appropriation doctrine, a stock pond fed by a running creek is not a distinct source. The original filing holds priority. That argument should already be in your legal brief." Clarence stared at her for a moment. He said, "It is. My lawyer made exactly that argument." "Then you have a strong case," she said. She picked up her basket and began adding items from her list. Then she paused and looked back at him and said, "Why are you losing?" He let out a long breath through his nose. "Because Cleary has 3 lawyers and money enough to delay the proceedings indefinitely, and delay is a strategy when your opponent has less money. My lawyer in Cheyenne is good, but he is one man." Sallie was quiet for a moment, moving along the counter. Then she said, "I have a small amount of money from the sale of my father's Cheyenne property. It isn't a great sum, but it might extend your legal resources." He stopped. He turned and looked at her fully. He said, "Miss Redmond, we met a week ago." "I know that," she said evenly. "You would offer money to a man you've known for one conversation. I would offer a practical resource to a neighbor whose legal position seems sound and whose cause seems just," she said. "And I have a practical reason that is not entirely altruistic. If Cleary wins those water rights, he will continue working his way down the valley. My ranch is on the East Fork. He will get to me eventually. Neighbors with a common interest have a long history of practical cooperation, Mr. Wilcox." He was quiet for a long moment. She did not fill the silence. He said finally, "I cannot take your money." "I'm not offering a gift," she said. "I'm offering a loan at whatever term is agreeable. If you win the water rights case, you repay it. If you lose, then we will discuss it." He looked at her that careful, assessing look, and she looked back at him without any particular pressure in her expression, just the steady, clear-eyed patience of a woman who had grown up on the land and understood that practical problems required practical solutions. He said, "I would need to think about it." "That's reasonable," she said. "I'm not going anywhere. I have a ranch to run." She paid for her supplies and gathered them into her basket, and at the door she paused and said, "Would it be an imposition if I rode out to see your operation sometime this week? I'd like to understand the water situation better, and I'll admit I'm interested in the land." He said, "It would not be an imposition." She nodded once and walked out, and the bell rang behind her, and 3 ranchers who had been watching this exchange from near the pickle barrel found something interesting to look at on the ceiling. She came on a Wednesday, riding a good brown mare that moved with the efficiency of a well-trained cow horse, and Clarence had the odd and unfamiliar experience of watching someone ride into his yard and feeling something other than wariness. She wore her practical coat and her plain hat, and she swung down from the mare with the practiced ease of a woman who had been riding since she could reach the stirrup, and she looked at his house and his barn and his corrals with the evaluative eye of a person who knows what they're looking at. Preston Wade came out of the barn when he heard hooves and stood there with his bad hip cocked and his hat pushed back and regarded her with the frankly assessing look of an old man who feels no particular obligation to be subtle. Clarence introduced them. Preston said, "You're Thomas Redmond's girl." "I am," she said. "Good man, your father, fair at cards." "He cheated at cards," she said pleasantly, "but only a little and only against people who could afford it." Preston blinked, and then he laughed, a short, rough sound that seemed to surprise him. He looked at Clarence and said nothing, but his expression said something quite clear. Clarence showed her the ranch, which took the better part of 2 hours because she asked good questions, and she wanted to see things rather than simply hear about them. He walked her down to the creek and showed her the original claim markers his grandfather had placed weathered cedar posts with brass plates engraved with the filing number, and he showed her the stock pond that Hargrove had built in 1874, which fed from the creek through a channel dug into the bank. It was a competent piece of work, the channel and the pond, but it was fed by the creek, and she pointed this out and said, "There's your case. That channel is the legal link. The pond has no independent source. My lawyer says the same," he said. "Your lawyer is right." She stood at the bank of the creek with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at the water running cold and clear over the smooth stones. The cottonwoods along the bank had gone fully gold now, and the leaves moved in the light wind with a paper sound. "This is good water," she said. "Best on the valley floor," he said. "That's why Cleary wants it." She turned and looked at him. In the afternoon light filtering through the cottonwood leaves, her eyes were more green than gray, and she had a dusting of color across her cheeks from the cold and the walk. She said, "Tell me about Cleary, not the legal situation. The man." Clarence thought about it. He said, "He is 60 years old and he has built everything he has by accumulation, not by building better but by acquiring more. He is not a cruel man in the way that some men are cruel, meaning he does not take pleasure in others' suffering. He is indifferent to it. He wants the land and the water because he wants them, and the fact that they belong to someone else is an inconvenience he expects to resolve with enough time and money." "Does he have men who work outside the law for him?" "He has men who work in the gray area between the law and outside it," Clarence said carefully. "There have been incidents, a fence cut here, a water channel blocked there. Nothing I could prove came from Cleary's order, nothing that constituted a crime under a sheriff who was elected with Cleary's support." Sallie absorbed this. She looked back at the creek. She said, "And the sheriff? Ed Burnett, he's not a bad man. He is a careful one. He knows which way the valley tilts and he does not tilt against it unless he has strong cause." "That seems like a useful thing to know," she said. They walked back to the house and Preston had made coffee, which was his way of indicating approval, since he made coffee for people he respected and did not for people he did not. They sat at Clarence's table in the 2-room house, and drank it while the afternoon light shifted outside. And Sallie asked about the cattle and the grazing patterns and the condition of the rangeland. And Clarence answered. And somewhere in the middle of this practical conversation, he noticed that he had stopped monitoring for exits and threats in the background of his attention, which was something he had been doing for so long that stopping felt strange, like a sound you had stopped hearing. She said near the end, "I'm going to write to a lawyer I know in Denver. He handled my father's Colorado dispute, and he knows water law specifically. It would cost nothing to have him review the brief. Would you allow it?" He looked at her across the table. The late afternoon light came through the south window and lay across the table between them in a long, warm bar. He said, "You are a remarkable person, Miss Redmond." She met his eyes without looking away. She said, "I am a practical one, but I will accept the compliment." She paused. "And Sallie is fine." "Clarence," he said. She smiled. It was the first time he had seen her really smile, and it changed the room, the way a fire changes a room, not by illuminating anything in particular, but by making the whole space warmer. The weeks that followed had the texture of something being built carefully, practically, and with a growing awareness on both sides that the thing being built was more than a legal strategy or a neighborly alliance. Sallie rode to the Wilcox Ranch twice more that October, and Clarence rode to the East Fork Ranch, once to help with the fence repair she was struggling to complete alone. And on both occasions the conversation moved through practical matters and then, with the ease of two people who have found a channel for thought, into larger things, into their histories and their losses and their opinions about the land and about people. And the thing that struck Clarence most consistently was that she said exactly what she thought. Not aggressively, but simply, the way a person says what they think when they have been raised to believe their thoughts have value. He told her about his parents. She told him about her father. She told him that she had been briefly engaged to a man in Cheyenne before her father became ill, and that when the illness came and she had gone home to care for Thomas, the engagement had dissolved in a way that revealed the man's character more clearly than anything else could have. He was not willing to wait, she said. She was very matter-of-fact about it, not bitter, which taught me that he had not been willing much in general. It was useful information, even if it was uncomfortable to receive. What happened to him? He married a banker's daughter within 4 months, she said, which confirmed the information. Clarence thought about this. He said, "I have not been engaged. I have not been close to it. The legal trouble and the isolation have not made it a simple matter to meet people." "No," she said. "I imagine not." They were riding the fence line of her east pasture on a gray November afternoon, cold enough now that their breath showed, and the horses moved steadily through the dry grass with a quiet efficiency. He had come to help her identify the worst sections of fence and mark them for spring repair, and they had been riding for an hour, and the conversation had moved through its natural progressions from fence rails to family history. She said, without particular emphasis, "Are you lonely?" He thought about it honestly. "Yes," he said. "I believe I have been for some time, though I became accustomed to it." "Becoming accustomed to something is not the same as it being good," she said. "No," he said. "You're right about that." She looked at him sideways from beneath her hat brim. She said, "I have been lonely since my father died. Before that I was not, because he was good company and the work was shared. Now the house is very quiet in the evenings." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "My house is quiet in the evenings too." The cold air moved between them and neither of them said anything else for a stretch. But the silence was a different kind of silence than the silences he had grown used to. It was a shared one rather than an empty one, and that difference was considerable. The letter from the Denver lawyer arrived in the second week of November. His name was Jonathan Briggs, and he had handled Sallie's father's Colorado case with competence and a degree of what Thomas Redmond had called lawyerly stubbornness, meaning he did not accept unfavorable interpretations as final. He had reviewed the summary of the Wilcox water rights case that Sallie had sent him, and his response was 4 pages of close, careful writing. Sallie brought it to Clarence on a Thursday. He read it at his kitchen table while she sat across from him with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and Preston Wade stood in the doorway with his arms crossed like a man guarding something. The fire in the chimney spoke occasionally in pops and hisses. Clarence read the letter twice. He set it down. "He says there is a procedural error in how the 1874 filing was recorded," he said. "Yes," said Sallie. "He says the territorial recorder failed to note the point of diversion from the original creek, which under the 1876 revised statutes is a required element of a valid filing." "Yes. That means the 1874 filing may be technically invalid regardless of the priority argument. Briggs thinks a motion to invalidate the filing on procedural grounds should be filed immediately," she said. "It is a different legal track than the one your Cheyenne lawyer is on. They could run simultaneously. Briggs says he would take the case at a reduced rate because the point of law interests him." Clarence put the letter down and looked at her. He said, "You did this." "I wrote a letter," she said. "Sallie." He said her name, and the way he said it, not as a correction or a deflection but as something much more direct, made her look up at him with an expression that was careful and steady and perhaps slightly held back. He said, "You have done more for this situation in 6 weeks than I have managed in 2 years. You have been managing it alone," she said. "Yes. That is the problem," she said. "Not your judgment or your capability. The problem is the alone part." The fire popped. Outside the window, the first snow of the season was beginning to come down in the thin preliminary way of November snow, not serious yet but promising. He said, "I know." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and something moved through the room that was not the draft from the window or the warmth from the fire, something that had been building since the market that first Saturday morning, and had found its way here to this table and this moment and this firelight. Preston Wade cleared his throat loudly from the doorway and said he was going to check on the horses, and he went out and closed the door with some firmness. Clarence said, "I think about you a great deal, Sallie." She was quiet. She set her coffee cup down carefully. She said, "I think about you too. I want to say it plainly. I am not good at saying things indirectly. I know I appreciate it." He said, "I am in a legal dispute that is not resolved. I have a ranch that has been deliberately undermined for 2 years. I have no great means. I cannot offer you an easy situation." "I did not come to you looking for an easy situation," she said. "I have my own ranch, my own situation, my own challenges. I did not come to you for rescue, Clarence." "I know that," he said. He leaned forward slightly and he said, "I came to you." She looked at him steadily. She said, "What does that mean?" "It means that for 2 years I have been a man that everyone steps around, and you walked directly toward me, and I have not been the same since. And I would like, if you are agreeable to it, to begin something that is not merely a legal strategy or a neighborly alliance." She considered him. She was quiet for long enough that he thought he might have misjudged, and the quality of his waiting was the careful kind, not fearful exactly but aware. Then she said, "I am agreeable to that." He reached across the table and took her hand. It was a gesture that was simple and deliberate, and she looked at his hand on hers, and then at his face, and something in her expression softened in a way that was not weakness, but its opposite, the kind of softening that happens when a person stops bracing and allows themselves to simply feel something good. "I am glad you walked toward me," he said. "So am I," she said. It snowed properly that night, and in the morning the valley was white and clean, and the cottonwoods along the creek stood like pencil marks against the pale sky. And Sallie rode home through it on her brown mare with her heart doing something it had not done in a long time, which was to feel something other than grief and the particular loneliness of being the last one left of a family. The courtship, and it was a courtship, formal and deliberate in the way that such things were in 1882, conducted within the sight of others, and according to the customs of the time, proceeded through the winter with the same combination of practicality and growing depth that had characterized it from the start. He rode to the East Fork twice a week when the weather and the work allowed, and she rode to his ranch on alternate days, and there was almost always something practical to accomplish that gave the visits a structure. a fence to review or a cattle count to compare or a letter from a lawyer to discuss. And within and around that structure the real thing grew steadily, like grass under snow. He brought her one of the cottonwood leaves he had pressed flat between two boards and dried, an impulse he had not analyzed before acting on, and she looked at it and then at him, and said thank you in a voice that was quieter than her usual voice. She brought him a jar of the apple butter she had put up from the gnarled tree in the southeast corner of her property, and he ate it on bread every morning for 2 weeks and thought about her. In December, Jonathan Briggs filed the motion to invalidate the 1874 filing in the Territorial Court in Cheyenne. The motion cited the procedural error in the original recording and requested a hearing at the court's earliest convenience. Chester Cleary's lawyers responded within 2 weeks with a counterbrief that ran to 60 pages, which was expensive, and showed the degree to which Cleary took the new development seriously. The news of the motion reached Harlan Creek through the usual channels, a note from Clarence's Cheyenne lawyer and a separate letter from Briggs, and reached Chester Cleary through whatever channels reached Chester Cleary, and the result was that on a cold December morning, a man rode into Sallie's yard. She was splitting wood near the barn when he rode in, and she straightened and held the hatchet without pointing it at anyone but without putting it down either. The man was not someone she knew. He was perhaps 45, well-dressed in a manner suggesting he was not a working rancher but something in the management end of things, with a gray coat and a hat that had seen better days but had been expensive once. He said his name was Forrest Alcott, and that he was Chester Cleary's operations manager, and he had come to speak with her about a matter of mutual interest. Sallie said, "Mr. Alcott, if Mr. Cleary has something to say to me, he is welcome to say it directly." Alcott shifted in his saddle. He said, "Mr. Cleary is of the opinion that the Redmond Ranch and the Wilcox water dispute are separate matters, and that there is no reason for them to become connected." "They are connected by geography and by legal precedent," she said, "and by the fact that I find the water rights case interesting. Mr. Cleary would consider it a neighborly gesture if you were to withdraw your interest from the case," Alcott said. She looked at him evenly. "And what does Mr. Cleary offer in return for this neighborly gesture?" "He offers to make no claim on the East Fork water as long as the Redmond Ranch is cooperative." It was a threat dressed as an offer, and she recognized the difference clearly. She said, "Tell Mr. Cleary that I appreciate the visit and that my answer is no. I also suggest he speak directly with me if he has further concerns. I find intermediaries inefficient." Alcott looked at her for a moment, and then he touched his hat and rode out of her yard, and she watched him go and then went back to splitting wood, but she drove the hatchet harder than before. She rode to Clarence's ranch that afternoon and told him about it. He sat across the table from her, and his jaw was set in the particular way it's set when he was managing something he was angry about. He said, "He came to your ranch." "He did." He made a threat. "A politely worded one, but yes." "I'm sorry," he said. "This is because of me." "This is because of Cleary," she said firmly. "Not you. Do not take on the blame for what Cleary does." He looked at her. She said, "Clarence, his behavior is not your responsibility. Your only responsibility is not to back down." He let out a long breath. He said, "I don't want you to be in difficulty because of me." "Then help me not be," she said. "Write to your Cheyenne lawyer today. Tell him about the visit. Document it. It may be relevant to the case. It shows Cleary's awareness of the threat the filing challenge poses." He looked at her for a moment and then nodded slowly. He said, "You think about this very clearly." "I am not the one whose name is on the case," she said. "That is what makes it easier for me to be clear. You are too close to it." "Yes," he said. He picked up her hand across the table in the way that had become a natural gesture between them, unhurried and certain. He said, "What would I do without you at this point?" She looked at their joined hands and then at his face. She said, "I prefer not to consider that." They wrote the letter to the Cheyenne lawyer together, which was practical and also not entirely practical. And they spent 2 hours at the table, and then he made supper, and she stayed for it, and Preston Wade ate with them and said very little, but his expression said a good deal, specifically that he was satisfied with the direction of events. After she had gone, Preston said to Clarence, "You are going to marry that woman." Clarence said, "I intend to ask her, yes." Preston said, "Ask her before spring. These winter months are long and I would like something to celebrate." Clarence said, "You'll have it before spring." He asked her in January. He rode to the East Fork on a clear January morning when the sky was the hard, bright blue that Wyoming produces in January, and the snow on the ground was crusted, and the cold was the dry, honest kind. He had been thinking about how to do it since December, and he had decided that, given who she was and how she thought, the indirect approach was wrong for her, and for him both. She was in the barn when he rode in, working with her mare, and she came out when she heard him and looked at him with her gray-green eyes bright from the cold and the work, and he got down from his horse and he did not waste time. He said, "Sallie, I love you. I believe I have been falling in love with you since the morning you walked across the market and asked me about rope, and every week since then has confirmed it. I want to marry you. I want to build something with you that is larger and better than either of us can build alone, and I want to come home to you every evening and stop having a quiet house." She looked at him for a moment. Her expression was that careful, steady thing, and he could see the emotion moving beneath it like weather moving beneath a clear sky, contained but real and significant. She said, "You love me." "Yes," he said. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying to work out how to tell you without simply saying it." He said, "Simply saying it seems good." "It does," she said. She looked at him in the morning sunlight with the snow-covered valley behind her, and she said, "Yes, I will marry you, Clarence." He took 3 steps and she stepped toward him, and he put his arms around her for the first time, really around her. Not the careful hand-holding of a careful courtship, but the full, direct, unhesitating embrace of 2 people who have been moving toward each other for months and have now arrived. And she held him back with equal force and directness. He said into her hair, "I want to give you a good life." "You already are," she said. Preston Wade, who had followed at a discreet distance, and was currently standing around the corner of the barn with his hat in his hands, allowed himself a short, fierce expression of satisfaction before putting his hat back on and walking away to do something that needed doing. They were married in March of 1883 at the small whitewashed church in Harlan Creek, in a ceremony that was attended by fewer people than would have attended if not for Chester Cleary's influence on the social arrangements of the valley, but attended with more genuine warmth by those who came. The minister was a spare, serious man who had been conducting services in the valley for a decade, and who married them in the direct, unembellished manner of a man who believes in what he's doing. Sallie wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had made herself over the winter months in the quiet evenings, and when she walked down the aisle of the small church with its 4 windows and its plain wooden pews and saw Clarence standing at the front with his dark eyes and his serious face, and the particular expression he had when he was trying not to show how much something mattered to him, she felt the last of the grief and the loneliness that had come in the door with her when she arrived in Harlan Creek go out of her like a long-held breath. He said his vows quietly and directly, looking at her the entire time. She said hers back in a steady voice with her hands in his and her eyes on his face. And when the minister said they were married, Preston Wade in the front row made a sound that was technically a cough, but was not actually a cough. They combined the ranches in the practical sense immediately following the wedding. Sallie moved her cattle and her belongings to Clarence's ranch, which was the better positioned operation, and they leased the East Fork property to a young couple newly arrived in the valley, the Harmon family, at a modest rate that gave the Harmons a start and gave Sallie and Clarence a small regular income and a piece of land they retained title to. The arrangement was her idea, and he recognized it instantly as a good one. They worked the combined ranch through the spring with a rhythm that surprised Clarence with its ease, not because he had expected difficulty, but because he had not understood how much of the weight of the previous 2 years had been the weight of doing everything alone. Sallie was a competent cattlewoman. She had grown up doing this work, and she had opinions about range management that were specific and well-reasoned, and they argued sometimes about approach with the productive kind of argument that two intelligent people in partnership have, the kind that produces better decisions than either would have reached alone. In April, the territorial court in Cheyenne set a hearing date for the motion to invalidate the 1874 filing. The hearing was scheduled for June. Jonathan Briggs rode up from Denver for it and spent 2 evenings at Clarence and Sallie's table going over the brief with a thoroughness that she clearly found satisfying, and that Clarence found simultaneously impressive and exhausting. The procedural argument was clean and well documented. The filing error was real. The only question was whether the territorial judge would find it dispositive or would allow Cleary's lawyers to argue around it. Chester Cleary himself attended the Cheyenne hearing, which was a measure of how seriously he took it. He sat on the far side of the courtroom with 2 of his lawyers and his operations manager Alcott, and he looked at Clarence with the flat, considering look of a man doing arithmetic, and Clarence looked back at him with the steady patience of a man who has stopped being afraid of the arithmetic. Sallie sat beside Clarence and held his hand, which she had done in the coach all the way from Harlan Creek, and continued to do in the courtroom because she saw no reason to stop. Briggs argued the motion for 45 minutes with the focused, deliberate manner of a man who knows exactly where the ground is solid. He cited the specific language of the 1876 revised statutes. He cited the original filing document. He cited 3 prior territorial court decisions in analogous situations, and he concluded by saying that the 1874 filing was procedurally defective on its face, and that no subsequent legal argument could correct a defect in the original document. Cleary's lead lawyer argued for an hour against this, and his argument was sophisticated and expensive and ultimately circular, returning again and again to the proposition that the equitable interests of an established water user should supersede a technical defect in the original recording, which was a compelling-sounding argument that had the disadvantage of being contrary to the explicit language of the statute. The judge was a gray-haired man named Haskell, who wore his authority without decorating it. He heard both arguments and he asked 3 questions of Briggs, 2 of which were about the specific statutory language, and 1 of which was about the point of diversion. And when Briggs answered the 3rd question, the judge's expression settled into the particular stillness of a man who has made up his mind. He issued his ruling from the bench. The 1874 filing was procedurally defective and therefore invalid. The original 1861 Wilcox filing held prior claim to the creek water. The court found in favor of Clarence Wilcox. The courtroom was quiet for a moment. Clarence said nothing. He sat very still. Sallie felt his hand tighten on hers, not a grip of triumph exactly, but of something more complex, the release of 2 years of pressure, a structural change, like a load-bearing wall coming down to reveal more sky. Then he turned and looked at her, and she saw his face, and she reached up and put her hand against his jaw the way she had not done before in a public place, and she said, "It's over." He said, "It's over." Briggs shook his hand and then hers, and the Cheyenne lawyer shook both their hands, and across the room Chester Cleary gathered his papers and his lawyers and left without looking back, and Alcott went after him, and the door of the courtroom closed, and Clarence and Sallie sat for a moment in the sudden quiet of a room that had held a great deal of contention and now held none. She said, "How do you feel?" He considered it honestly. He said, "Like I can breathe all the way." They rode the stage home to Harlan Creek the following day, arriving in the late afternoon when the summer light was long and golden across the valley, and when they drove into the main street, they were greeted by something Clarence had not experienced in 2 years, which was ordinary pleasantness. The shopkeeper came out of the market to wave. The blacksmith called congratulations from his doorway. 3 ranch women whom Sallie had come to know over the winter months came across the street to speak to her, and one of them, a forthright woman named Margaret Plunkett whose husband ran sheep east of town, embraced her and said, "I am so glad of this news." This was the shape of what the court ruling had changed, not an overnight transformation of the valley's social arrangements, but the gradual resumption of ordinary human intercourse that Cleary's influence had interrupted. The people of Harlan Creek were not, for the most part, bad or cowardly. They had been operating under a practical pressure that had now been substantially reduced. Preston Wade, when they arrived at the ranch, had made a pot of beans and cornbread and a small dried apple cake, which was the most elaborate cooking he had done in Clarence's memory, and he served it with the expression of a man who will not be emotional about this under any circumstances whatsoever but who is nonetheless emotional about it. After supper, when Sallie had gone to check on the horses, and it was just the 2 men at the table, Preston said, "Your father would have liked this very much." Clarence said, "I know," Preston said. "He would have liked her too." "I know that as well," said Clarence. Preston looked at his coffee cup. He said, "I am glad you are happy." Clarence said, "Thank you, Preston. So am I." The summer was full in the way that summers are full when a long difficulty has been removed, and there is space for everything else to grow. They worked the cattle through the summer grazing season with the combined strength of 2 capable people and 1 veteran old man with an aching hip, and the herd was in the best condition it had been in 3 years. The rangeland was good that year, adequate rain in April and May, hot and dry in June and July, which was exactly right for the grass. And when the fall market came, Clarence got a better price per head than he had in 4 years. At the fall market, on a Saturday morning in September of 1883, Sallie watched the social geography of the room with a quiet attention she had developed since her first visit in October of the previous year. The avoidance circle that had surrounded Clarence that first morning was simply gone. Men came up to him and talked. The large-bellied shopkeeper, she had learned his name, was Henry Morse, greeted him by name and asked about the herd. A rancher she did not know well came over and said he was considering an offer from Cleary on a piece of grazing land and asked Clarence's opinion, and Clarence gave it honestly, which was that Cleary's offers were not to be dismissed but should be reviewed carefully. Chester Cleary himself was at the market that morning, which was not unusual. He was a tall, heavy-set man in his 60s with white hair, and the particular face of a man who has gotten most of what he wanted for most of his life. Not a mean face, but not a generous one. He looked at Clarence across the room, and Clarence looked back, and there was between them the complicated acknowledgement of 2 men who have fought a hard legal battle and know where it ended. Cleary did not avoid Clarence. He came over. He said, "Wilcox." He looked at Sallie. "Mrs. Wilcox." "Mr. Cleary," Sallie said. He said to Clarence, "You had good lawyers." "I had the correct legal position," Clarence said, "and good lawyers." Cleary looked at him for a moment. He said, "I am not a man who holds grudges when the court has spoken." He paused. "I may be interested in a water-sharing arrangement for the stock pond if you are open to it. It is no longer worth the legal cost to argue otherwise. I would like it on terms we both find reasonable." Clarence said, "I am open to a conversation." Cleary nodded. He looked at Sallie again briefly, and she saw in his expression something that was not quite respect but was perhaps something adjacent to it, the recognition of a force that had been applied against him effectively. He touched his hat and moved on. Sallie said quietly to Clarence, "That was graceful of him." "He is a practical man," Clarence said. "When it stops being practical to fight, he stops fighting." "That is perhaps his best quality," she said. He looked at her. "Do you find yourself sympathizing with Cleary?" "I find myself understanding that most conflicts end the same way," she said. "The people involved get older and the cost gets higher, and eventually someone looks at the arithmetic." He smiled, that full, real smile that she had spent a year learning the warmth of. He said, "You are the most sensible person I have ever met." "I am going to use that as currency," she said. "Starting now. I want to buy that set of cast iron pans that Morse has on the back shelf." He laughed. In the market, near the flour barrels, Henry Morse looked up at the sound and noted it with satisfaction, because in the year he had known Clarence Wilcox, the man had not laughed much, and it was good to hear. The water-sharing arrangement with Cleary was negotiated over 2 autumn meetings and formalized in writing in November, which gave the Wilcox Creek its protected status and gave Cleary's stock pond a guaranteed right to continue drawing from the channel at a specified rate. Briggs reviewed the agreement and said it was fair and durable. Sallie read it twice and said the same. Clarence signed it and then went outside and stood on the porch for a while looking at the valley, at the long view south to the mountains and west to the ridgeline where the cottonwoods marked the creek, and Sallie came out and stood beside him. She said, "All of it. Done." "All of it," he said. She slipped her arm through his. He looked at her profile against the November sky and thought about what Preston had said. Your father would have liked her. He thought about his grandfather filing on the creek in 1861, planting those cedar posts with their brass plates, and about the long line of intention and work and care that connected that morning to this one. He said, "I want to tell you something." She looked up at him. The wind moved her hair across her face and she pushed it back. He said, "I have spent the last several years, since my parents died, since the legal trouble began, I have been existing rather than living. I have been managing rather than building. I had forgotten what it was like to want things that were not defensive. You gave that back to me, the wanting of things, not just the protection of things." She was quiet for a moment. Her eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with the precursor of them, the shimmer that comes before. She said, "You gave the same to me. I came here grieving and practical and trying to manage on my own because that was what was required. You gave me someone to want things with." He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and the valley spread out before them in the November light with its burned gold grass and its white-capped distant mountains and its creek threading through the cottonwoods, and neither of them said anything else for a while because nothing else needed saying. That winter was a good one in the way that winters can be good, harder than summer but full in a different way. The evenings long by firelight, the days structured by the particular demands of winter cattle work. The house no longer quiet in the evenings, but alive with the sound of 2 people who have things to say to each other and time to say them. Preston Wade had developed a habit of eating supper with them most evenings, and then retiring to his bunkhouse, which suited all 3 parties. He had been at the ranch for so long that he moved through it with the ease of a person in their own home, and Sallie had regarded this from the first not as an intrusion but as what it was, which was a household. She had grown up in a household where the people who worked the land were people, not furniture, and she treated Preston accordingly. One evening in December, Preston told them that his daughter in Nebraska had written asking him to come east for a visit. Sallie said, "You should go. You haven't seen her in 4 years." Preston said he supposed he might go in February when the work was slowest. Clarence said, "We'll manage the operation. Go." Preston looked between them with the expression of an old man who knows he is not actually needed any more in the way he once was, and finds this fact simultaneously gratifying and melancholy. He said, "You'll need extra help in February for the early calving." "I'll hire someone," Clarence said. "I know a young man in town," Sallie said. "Billy Harmon, the eldest son of the Harmon family at the East Fork lease. He's 16 and works hard. He can come for the calving weeks." Preston nodded. He said, "All right then." And they did not speak about it further, because it was settled. The spring came early in 1884. March brought warm air from the south earlier than usual, and the grass greened up by the last week of the month, and the calving went well, and Billy Harmon proved himself the capable young man Sallie had said he was, working long days without complaint and learning quickly when either Clarence or Sallie showed him something. Preston returned from Nebraska in April with slightly less bad hip, which he attributed to his daughter's cooking, and with a new hat that she had given him, which he wore with the self-consciousness of a man unaccustomed to being fussed over and not entirely unwilling to be. In late April, Sallie told Clarence she believed she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, before the day's work began, standing in the kitchen while the coffee was still brewing. She said it directly, which was her way, with her eyes on his face and a steadiness in her expression that held all the many things she was feeling: happiness and anxiety and wonder, and the practical awareness of what lay ahead. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her face in both hands and looked at her with an expression she had never seen from him before, something that was beyond happiness, something older and more essential, and he said, "Sallie." She said, "Yes." He said, "We are going to have a child." She said, "We are," he said in a voice that was very quiet. "My grandfather filed on this creek so that there would be something to leave. My parents built on this ranch so that there would be something to carry forward." He paused. "There will be something to carry forward." She put her hands over his. She said, "And forward after that." He kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and then he held her in the kitchen while the coffee boiled over on the stove, and neither of them noticed. Preston was told over breakfast, and he put his fork down and looked at his plate for a moment and then looked up at them with an expression that was entirely unguarded for once, and he said, "Thomas Redmond would be very happy today." "He would," Sallie said. "Your parents too," Preston said to Clarence. "Yes," Clarence said. Preston picked up his fork again. He said, "Well, there will be more help around here eventually." Sallie laughed, which was the best sound Clarence knew. The summer of 1884 was one of the good ones, warm and green and busy, and Sallie worked the ranch through most of it with the same capability she had brought to everything, making adjustments as her condition required but not retreating from the life she had built. Clarence moved through the days of that summer with a quality of attention she recognized as the attention of a man who is deeply, straightforwardly happy present in each thing, not because he had decided to be, but because there was nowhere else he wanted to be. In September, the court filing arrangement with Cleary was tested briefly when one of Cleary's younger hands opened the channel flow gate without authorization, but it was resolved without rancor when Cleary himself, informed of it, closed the gate and sent a written apology. The note was brief and without particular warmth, but it was honest, and it acknowledged the terms, and Clarence showed it to Sallie, and she said, "He is learning to mean it." The child, a boy, was born in November of 1884, on a cold and perfectly clear Tuesday, with the assistance of the valley's experienced midwife, a German woman named Frau Kettler, who had delivered half the children in the county, and who worked with an economy of motion, and word that Sallie found deeply reassuring. The birth was long but not dangerous, and Clarence, who had spent the night in the house because nothing on earth could have moved him further away than that, was allowed in when it was done. He came to the bed where Sallie lay with the bundled infant, and he sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the child in his arms and watched his face. He held the boy with the careful, slightly terrified competence of a man holding a newborn for the first time, supporting the head with the instinct that seems to arrive from nowhere in those moments. And he looked at the tiny, serious face with its dark eyes that were already beginning to look like his eyes, and the room was quiet, and outside the window the clear November stars were making the particular arrangement they make in Wyoming November skies. He said, "Hello." The baby looked at him with the ancient, exhausted gaze of the newly arrived. Sallie said from beside him, "He looks like you already." Clarence said, not taking his eyes from the boy, "What should we call him?" She had been thinking about this for months. She said, "Thomas, for my father." He looked at her. He said, "Thomas Wilcox." "Yes," she said. He said, "Thomas Preston Wilcox, if you are agreeable." She looked at him at the generosity and simplicity of the gesture. She said, "I am very agreeable to that." In the morning they told Preston, who came in from the barn where he had spent the night because he had not been able to stay in his bunkhouse, he said, with characteristic gruffness. He was given the baby to hold, and he accepted this with the expression of a man who has not held a baby in 30 years, and is rediscovering that it is both more alarming and more remarkable than he remembered. He said, after a long, quiet moment, "Thomas Preston." "Yes," Sallie said. Preston said nothing else for a while. He held the baby with great care and looked at the small face and then out the window at the winter morning and then at Clarence. And whatever he meant to say he could not say, but they understood it, all of it, and it did not need saying. The following years built themselves out of the same materials as the first work and weather, and the thousand small decisions that add up to a life on the land, and love that deepened the way a river deepens, not by going faster but by going longer, carving its course more surely into the country it moved through. They hired 2 permanent hands by 1886, as the herd grew back toward the numbers Clarence had run before the legal troubles, young men of good character who knew their work, and who existed in the household of the Wilcox Ranch with the ease of people in a well-ordered place. Billy Harmon, who had helped during that first calving, came on full-time when he turned 18, and proved over time to be as capable and steady as Sallie had seen in him when he was 16. Preston Wade's hip worsened in the winter of 1885, and he made the decision, announced over supper on a February evening with the matter-of-fact resignation of a man who has accepted something, to go to Nebraska permanently in the spring. His daughter had room for him, he said. There was less useful work to do there, he said, but there was also no snow in January mostly. Sallie got up from the table and embraced him, which surprised him sufficiently that he held still for a moment before he put one arm around her in return and patted her back twice, and then he said, all right," and she laughed and released him. Clarence said, "This ranch has your work in it, Preston. Every fence post and every outbuilding and every choice about the cattle and the land. It is in here." Preston said, "That's enough then." He left in April of 1886 on the stage to Cheyenne, and from there the train to Nebraska, and the morning he left Clarence stood in the yard and watched the stage until it was out of sight, and then he went back to work, because that was what Preston would have done. A letter came in July saying Preston had arrived safely, and that Nebraska was flat and warm and his hip was better, and his daughter fed him extremely well. He enclosed a note for Thomas Preston, who was not yet 2 and could not read, but who was shown the letter and treated it with the gravity of a child who intuits that some things matter even if he does not yet know why. The Wilcox Ranch by 1887 was a prospering operation. 500 head, good range, reliable water, and the kind of reputation that comes not from a single event but from years of consistent honest dealing. People who had avoided Clarence in the Harlan Creek market now sought his opinion on cattle decisions and grazing questions, and he gave his opinions as he always had, directly and without embellishment. In the spring of 1887, Sallie told him she was expecting again. He received this the same way he had received it the first time, with his hands on her face, and an expression that went beyond any word she might have used to describe it. She said, "I have a theory that it will be a girl this time." He said, "Do you now? Thomas has your eyes," she said. "This one will have mine." He said, "I would not mind either way." "No," she said, "I know that." She leaned against him in the kitchen where she had told him about Thomas 3 years before, and he held her in the morning light, and the ranch was alive outside with the sounds of spring, cattle and birds, and the creek running high with the snowmelt. And Thomas was somewhere in the yard making noise with rocks, and the life they had built was all around them, full and real and well-made. The baby was a girl, born in November of 1887, and Sallie was right about the eyes. She came into the world with her mother's shifting gray-green gaze and a quantity of auburn hair that made the midwife remark approvingly. They named her Clara, after Clarence's mother, and she announced herself from the first hour as a person of opinion and volume who would not be sleeping when anyone else wanted her to sleep. Thomas, who was almost 3 and had opinions of his own about most things, was introduced to his sister with the mixed feelings of a person discovering that the world has expanded in a direction he had not fully anticipated. After some reflection, he declared her acceptable. Clarence held Clara the first morning as he had held Thomas, with that same expression that Sallie had no word for except perhaps that it was the expression of a man arriving at something he had not known he was traveling toward until he was there. He said, "Hello, Clara." She looked at him with her mother's eyes. He said to Sallie, "You were right about the eyes." "I usually am," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are." The years settled into themselves, as years do when a life is working. Harlan Creek grew through the late 1880s as the territory grew new families, new buildings, a school that had been talked about since before Sallie arrived and finally opened in the autumn of 1888. She was one of the people who had argued for it at the county meeting, standing up in the meeting hall with her characteristic directness, and saying that the children of this valley deserved an education regardless of whether their families could afford to send them to the city for it, and that the community was capable of funding and staffing a school if it was willing to do so. The school opened with 15 students and a young teacher from Ohio named Mr. Gaines, who was dedicated, if slightly overwhelmed by the practical realities of a Wyoming classroom. Thomas Wilcox was among the first students. He was 4.5 years old, and he approached school with the same patient observation his father had, and the same directness his mother had. And Mr. Gaines noted after the first week that Thomas was the student in the room, most likely to ask exactly the question everyone was afraid to ask, which Sallie heard and considered a compliment. Chester Cleary died in the spring of 1889. Which was noted by the valley without great mourning, but with respect for the life he had built, and a general sense that his passing cleared some old weather from the air. His son, a younger and somewhat more straightforward man named David, took over the operation and in his first month rode out to the Wilcox Ranch to introduce himself and affirm that the water-sharing arrangement would continue under his management. Clarence met him at the gate and shook his hand, and they talked for an hour, standing in the May morning by the corral, and when David Cleary rode out, Clarence came back to the house and told Sallie about it. She said, "And he seems like a reasonable man," Clarence said. "He said his father's greatest mistake was making the water rights into a war rather than a negotiation from the beginning." "His father's second greatest mistake," she said. "His first was assuming that having money and influence meant he could make the law say what he wanted." Clarence looked at her. He said, "You never forgave him for sending Alcott to your yard." "I understood him," she said. "That is different from forgiving him, but I am glad his son is a different kind of man." "So am I," Clarence said. He came and sat beside her at the kitchen table where Thomas was doing his schoolwork and Clara was doing something involving a tin cup and a quantity of dried beans that seemed to give her great satisfaction. He said, looking at the table full of his family, "I think about that morning at the market sometimes." She looked up at him. "Which morning?" "The first one," he said. "When you walked across the room and asked me about rope." She smiled. She said, "I needed to know about rope." "I know," he said. "That is what I like about it. You needed to know about rope, and you asked the most practical person available, and the fact that every other rancher in the room had decided to avoid him was not a factor in your calculation." "It was a factor," she said. "It made me more interested, not less." He said, "Why?" She considered it, as she considered everything honestly and with real attention. She said, "Because when everyone avoids a person, they have usually made a decision based on something other than the person himself. I wanted to see what was actually there rather than what everyone had decided was there." He said, "And what did you find?" She reached across the table and took his hand, the same gesture they had been making since that November afternoon in this kitchen 3 years into an ongoing conversation that neither of them had any intention of ending. She said, "A man worth walking toward." He held her hand. Thomas looked up from his schoolwork briefly, assessed the situation as not requiring his input, and went back to his arithmetic. Clara managed to get most of the dried beans into the tin cup and regarded this achievement with deep personal satisfaction. Outside the south window, the spring light fell across the valley in long golden lines, and the creek ran clear over its stones, and the cottonwoods were putting out their new leaves, bright and particular and soft as anything, and the cattle moved in the pasture in the steady way of cattle that are well fed and at peace with the country they are in. By 1890, the Wilcox Ranch had grown to 630 head and employed 3 permanent hands, and the name Wilcox in Harlan Creek County carried the particular weight of a name that has earned its place through time and honesty. Sallie had become, almost without designing it, a person that the women of the valley brought their problems to, not because she set herself up as an authority, but because she had a reputation for clear thinking and honest counsel, and for not telling a person what they wanted to hear when what they needed to hear was something else. She served on the school board from 1889 forward, and on the water committee from the same year, and she wrote letters to the county commissioner's office with a regularity that the commissioner had reportedly come to both respect and regard with mild apprehension. She was not aggressive or imperious in these activities. She was simply competent and consistent, which in her experience was more effective than either. Clarence watched all of this with the kind of pride that sits quietly beside the thing it is proud of without making a production of itself. He said to her once, when she came home from a school board meeting having argued successfully for an additional textbook allocation, "You are changing this valley." She said, "I am participating in it." "That is different," he said, "perhaps not as different as you think." They were both right, as they usually were about most things, which was one of the pleasures of being in conversation with each other. A letter arrived from Preston Wade in the spring of 1890, written in his daughter's hand because his own had become uncertain, saying that he was well, and that Nebraska remained flat, and that he thought of the ranch most days and was glad to hear by various reports that it was thriving. He sent a carved wooden horse he had made over the winter for Thomas, and a small braided grass ring for Clara, which he said was a trick his own daughter had taught him when she was young. Sallie read the letter aloud at supper, and Thomas received the wooden horse with solemnity, and Clara wore the grass ring until it fell apart 3 days later, which took longer than Sallie expected because Clara was generally hard on small things. Clarence wrote back, and Sallie added a page of her own, and Thomas dictated a message, and Clara contributed a mark with a pencil that was represented to Preston as a drawing of the ranch. The response came in July, shorter than usual but warm. Preston said he was glad to know them. He said the bunkhouse they had given him was the best place he had slept since he was a young man, and that the creek sound in the evening through the window was something he still heard sometimes when he was going to sleep in Nebraska. He said to tell the children he thought of them. He died in October of 1890, quietly, in his sleep, according to his daughter's letter that arrived in November. He had been 69 years old and had spent most of those years in useful work on good land with people he respected, and had died warm and looked after, which was not the worst way a man could leave the world. Clarence sat with that letter in the kitchen for a long time, and Sallie sat with him, and they did not try to make it smaller than it was. After a while she said, "He loved this ranch." "He did," Clarence said. She said, "He loved you." Clarence was quiet. He said, "He never said it in words." "No," she said, "he said it in everything else." He looked at her across the table. He said, "I want to plant something for him on the ranch." She said, "There's a good spot by the spring where the cottonwoods don't shade in the afternoon. We could plant an apple tree." He looked at her. He said, "That is exactly right." They planted the apple tree in the spring, and Thomas helped dig the hole with a small shovel Clarence had made to the right size for a 6-year-old, and Clara stood nearby and supervised with the certainty of someone who has opinions about holes. The tree was a variety that the nurseryman in Harlan Creek said would do well at that elevation, and they watered it through its first summer, and it took hold and grew, slow and certain, the way good things grow. The years continued to build. There was a drought year in 1891 that tested everyone in the valley and required the water-sharing arrangement with Cleary's son to be renegotiated briefly for the driest months. A negotiation that Sallie and David clearly conducted at the Harlan Creek market one Saturday morning, with a directness and practical goodwill that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier, and which took 40 minutes and ended with a handshake, and terms that both operations could manage. There was a hard winter in 1892 that took a portion of the herd, as hard winters do, but not more than they could rebuild from, and they rebuilt steadily through 1893 and 1894 until the numbers were back and better. Thomas grew into a boy of considerable seriousness and capability, interested in the cattle and the land in a way that was not merely inherited but genuine, asking questions about range management and water cycles that reflected actual observation. By the time he was 10, he could ride well and read the grass and identify the signs of a good year and a difficult one, and he helped with the work in the ways that a 10-year-old can help, which is to say considerably. Clara grew into a person of equal capability and considerably more social complexity, with her mother's directness and a sociability that went beyond either parent, comfortable in the market and the schoolyard and the ranch with equal ease. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's ability to say the true thing simply, and she had a gift for the horses that was noticed by everyone who watched her work with them. Sallie looked at her children sometimes in the evenings, in the kitchen that had been the site of so many conversations and decisions and ordinary meals, and she thought about the morning she had left Cheyenne after her father's funeral with her grief and her practicality and her list of things to do. And she thought about the market, and the man standing at the rope display, and every rancher giving him wide berth, and she thought about the moment she had decided to walk directly toward him. She had not, in that moment, expected any of this. She had expected to ask a question about rope, which she had done. Everything else had followed from that, from the simple decision to move toward rather than away from a thing she did not yet understand. She said to Clarence one evening in the fall of 1894, sitting on the porch in the last of the September light, watching Thomas and Clara moving in the south pasture, "Do you ever think about how close it was to not happening?" he said. "What do you mean?" "I mean that if I had asked Henry Morse about the rope instead of you, and if you had left the market before I arrived, and if the stage had been a day later and any of a dozen small different things, we would not be here." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I think about it sometimes." She said, "Does it frighten you?" He considered it honestly. He said, "It makes me careful about the now." She nodded. She understood this precisely. She put her hand in his, that old, certain gesture, and they sat on the porch in the September evening and watched the light change on the valley and listened to the creek in the cottonwoods and to the sounds of their children in the pasture. And the apple tree by the spring had grown tall enough to make shade now, and the cattle were settled, and the ranch was what it had taken years and effort and will and love to make it, a good place, a real place, with deep roots and clear water, and the kind of peace that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the knowledge that you have met difficulty and continued. Thomas called from the pasture about something, some question about a section of fence, and Clarence stood up and called back and then looked at Sallie and said, "I should go see." She said, "Go." He took 3 steps down from the porch and then he stopped and turned back to look at her, sitting in the porch chair with the September light on her face and her gray-green eyes watching him. And he said what he said sometimes, simply and without ornamentation. "I love you," she said. "I love you too. Now go see about the fence." He grinned the full, real grin that she had first seen as a ghost and had spent years knowing in its full form. And he walked out across the yard toward the pasture and toward his son and toward whatever the fence had to say for itself. And the evening closed around the ranch like something familiar and safe, and the stars came out above Wyoming in the great unpolluted darkness of 1894, and the creek ran on through the night. And in the morning there would be more work and more weather and more years of this life they had made together, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.